Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the massive battleship Yamato, watching the Pacific horizon shimmer under the early morning sun of June 3, 1942. The greatest naval armada Japan had ever assembled stretched across the ocean like a steel constellation. 165 warships carrying the dreams of an empire that believed itself destined to rule the Pacific. 6 months after Pearl Harbor had brought America into the war, Yamamoto knew that time was Japan's enemy. The sleeping giant was awakening, and only a decisive blow could secure Japan's dominance before American industrial might could overwhelm them. The plan was audacious in its scope and complexity. Operation MI would capture Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral and sand 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii, drawing the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet into a trap where Japan's superior numbers and experience would annihilate them forever. Yamamoto's strategy relied on deception and overwhelming force. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention north, while his main force would strike Midway like a thunderbolt from the west. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier striking force, the Kido Butai, spearhead of Japanese naval aviation. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, carried 272 of Japan's finest aircraft and most experienced pilots. These were the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and swept British forces from the Indian Ocean. Their air crews were veterans of countless battles, their confidence unshakable after 6 months of uninterrupted victory. According to naval historians referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the Japanese plan represented the pinnacle of their strategic thinking, combining multiple simultaneous operations designed to stretch American forces beyond their breaking point. But unknown to Yamamoto, American cryptanalysts had penetrated the Japanese naval code JN-25. In the basement of a building in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of codebreakers had been intercepting and decoding Japanese radio traffic for months. They knew Operation MI was coming, they knew Midway was the target, and most crucially, they knew when the attack would arrive. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, faced an agonizing decision. His fleet was outnumbered nearly 4-1, and many of his ships were still damaged from previous engagements. The carrier Yorktown had limped back from the Battle of the Coral Sea with a damaged flight deck, and would need months of repairs under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Nimitz ordered emergency repairs completed in 72 hours, knowing that every carrier would be needed for the coming battle. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, centered around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, would follow with the hastily repaired Yorktown. Together they carried 233 aircraft, barely enough to challenge one of Nagumo's carrier divisions, let alone his entire force. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, the stage was set for a battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese fleet approached Midway with supreme confidence, unaware that their enemies knew exactly where they were and when they would strike. In the pre-dawn darkness, both fleets prepared for combat, neither knowing that the next few hours would witness one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The first rays of sunlight painted the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, as Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led 108 Japanese aircraft toward Midway Atoll. Below them, the ocean stretched endlessly, concealing the American fleet that Nagumo believed was still in port at Pearl Harbor. The strike force consisted of 36 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi D-3A Valdive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, the cream of Japanese naval aviation. At Midway, the defenders had been expecting them. Radar operators had detected the incoming formation at 5:53 a.m., 158 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as 26 Marine Corps fighters scrambled to intercept, obsolete Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and a handful of newer Grumman F-4F Wildcats. Major Floyd Parks led the Marine fighters into what they knew would be a desperate fight against overwhelming odds. The aerial battle over Midway was brief and savage. The experienced Japanese pilots in their superior Zeros carved through the Marine formation like wolves among sheep. 15 American fighters were shot down in minutes, with 7 more damaged beyond repair. But their sacrifice bought precious time for the ground defenses. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire as Tomonaga's bombers swept over Eastern Island, their bombs cratering runways and destroying fuel facilities. The power plant erupted in flames, and the seaplane hangar collapsed in a shower of twisted metal. Despite the destruction, Midway's defenses remained largely intact. As Tomonaga surveyed the damage from his cockpit, he realized that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize the base completely. His radio message to Admiral Nagumo at 7:00 a.m. would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack wave. Meanwhile, American aircraft from Midway were already airborne, hunting for the Japanese fleet. At 6:15 a.m., Navy Ensign Jack Reed, flying a consolidated PBY Catalina patrol bomber, spotted Nagumo's carriers through broken clouds. His electrifying radio message, "Many planes heading Midway bearing 320, distance 150, was followed minutes later by an even more crucial sighting. 2 carriers and main body, bearing 320, distance 180. The aged bombers and torpedo planes of Midway's garrison launched immediately, knowing they faced almost certain destruction. Army Air Force B-26 Marauders, Navy TBF Avengers, and Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers raced toward the Japanese fleet in a series of uncoordinated attacks. The results were catastrophic for the Americans. Most aircraft were shot down by Zeros or anti-aircraft fire, scoring no hits on the Japanese carriers. But these desperate attacks served a crucial purpose. They convinced Admiral Nagumo that Midway's defenses were stronger than expected, and that a second strike was indeed necessary. At 7:15 a.m., he made the decision that would doom his fleet. The second wave of aircraft, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against enemy ships, would be rearmed with land attack weapons for another strike against Midway. As Japanese deck crews frantically moved ammunition and refueled aircraft, Nagumo received disturbing news. At 7:28 a.m., a reconnaissance plane reported sighting American ships to the northeast. The message was incomplete and confusing, mentioning 10 enemy surface ships, but failing to identify any carriers. Nagumo hesitated, then ordered the reconnaissance plane to ascertain the composition of the American force. The rearming process continued, but doubt crept into Japanese planning. Were American carriers present, or merely cruisers and destroyers fleeing from Midway? The answer would determine whether Japan achieved its greatest naval victory or suffered its most devastating defeat. As minutes ticked by, aircraft crowded the flight decks of the Japanese carriers, fully fueled and armed with high-explosive bombs, sitting targets for any enemy attack. Unknown to Nagumo, Admiral Fletcher had already launched his strike. At 7:02 a.m., Task Force 17 began launching aircraft from Yorktown, while Spruance's Task Force 16 had been launching since 7:00 a.m. from Enterprise and Hornet. 156 American aircraft were now racing toward the Japanese fleet, carrying the hopes of a nation and the fate of the Pacific War in their bomb bays. At 8:09 a.m. on June 4th, the reconnaissance floatplane from the cruiser Tone finally transmitted the message that sent shockwaves through Admiral Nagumo's flagship. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier in position 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. The American Pacific Fleet, which Japanese intelligence insisted was still licking its wounds at Pearl Harbor, was not only present but dangerously close. Panic rippled through the Kido Butai as the implications became clear. Nagumo faced an agonizing tactical dilemma that would have tested even the greatest naval commanders in history. His first strike against Midway was returning, running low on fuel and ammunition, desperately needing to land immediately. His second wave sat on deck, armed with land attack bombs instead of the armor-piercing weapons needed to sink warships. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the horizon, American carriers were almost certainly launching their own strike forces. The admiral's decision revealed the flaws in Japanese tactical doctrine. Instead of immediately launching his available aircraft against the American carriers, Nagumo chose to recover his midway strike force first, then rearm all aircraft properly before launching a coordinated attack. It was the textbook solution, the cautious approach that prioritized organization over speed. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the correct decision. But these circumstances were far from normal. At 9:25 a.m., Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet toward the Japanese fleet. Flying obsolete Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, Waldron's 15 aircraft represented the first wave of the American counterattack. The squadron had trained together for months, and their commander had studied Japanese tactics obsessively, correctly predicting the enemy's likely position. Waldron's attack was both heroic and tragic. Approaching at low altitude without fighter escort, the slow, lumbering Devastators were sitting ducks for Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. One by one, the American torpedo bombers fell into the sea under the guns of Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya's fighters. Within minutes, 14 of 15 aircraft were destroyed, and only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the ocean and witnessing the remainder of the battle from his life raft. According to military historian Gordon Pranga's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8, while tactically futile, served a crucial strategic purpose by drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupting their defensive formations. The slaughter continued as more American torpedo squadrons arrived piecemeal. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, met the same fate as Waldron's men. Of 14 aircraft, 10 were shot down without scoring a single hit. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, lost 12 of 13 aircraft in their attack run. By 10:24 a.m., the American torpedo bomber force had been virtually annihilated. Japanese sailors cheered as the last burning Devastator crashed into the Pacific, believing they had weathered the storm. Admiral Nagumo allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His carriers remained untouched. His air defenses had performed magnificently, and the Americans had revealed the weakness of their tactics. But the torpedo attacks, costly as they were, had achieved something the Americans never intended. Every Japanese fighter had been drawn down to sea level to massacre the torpedo bombers. The combat air patrol was out of position, low on ammunition, and scattered across the ocean. The flight decks of all 4 carriers were crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, creating a perfect target for any high-altitude attack. At that precise moment, 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, emerged from a cloud layer at 14,000 feet. They had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, flying beyond their planned search area on McCluskey's intuition. Now they looked down at a sight that would be burned into naval history forever. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, their flight decks packed with planes and fuel lines, completely defenseless against aerial attack. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio. "Attack immediately." The fate of empires now rested in the hands of young American pilots diving through the morning sky toward the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. At 10:22 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the Pacific War reached its turning point in the span of 5 catastrophic minutes. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's 37 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise had found their target. The Japanese carrier force spread across the ocean like sitting ducks, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. McCluskey divided his formation, leading one section against the flagship carrier Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best took the other section toward Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's command ship. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived with 17 more Dauntlesses from Yorktown, targeting the carrier Soryu. The Japanese, caught completely off guard with their fighters at sea level chasing the last torpedo bombers, had no high-altitude protection. The first bomb struck Kaga amidships at 10:24 a.m., detonating among aircraft armed with torpedoes and bombs. The explosion chain reacted through the ship like a string of firecrackers, turning the pride of the Japanese fleet into a blazing inferno. Fuel lines ruptured, spreading aviation gasoline across the flight deck, where it ignited in sheets of flame that reached toward the sky like grasping fingers. Seconds later, Lieutenant Best's section screamed down toward Akagi. Best himself, leading the attack, released his 1,000-pound bomb at 1,500 feet and pulled out of his dive as anti-aircraft fire filled the air around him. The bomb struck just behind the carrier's island superstructure, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar deck among armed and fueled aircraft. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the forward elevator completely out of its shaft. Admiral Nagumo, standing on Akagi's bridge moments before, felt the deck buckle beneath his feet as his flagship transformed into a death trap. Fires spread rapidly through the ship's interior, fed by aviation gasoline and exploding ammunition. The carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor was now a floating pyre, its destruction visible for miles across the Pacific. The third carrier, Soryu, met the same fate under Leslie's attack. 3 direct hits in rapid succession turned the ship into an inferno, her aircraft exploding like Roman candles as flames consumed everything combustible. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, facing the loss of his ship, chose to go down with her rather than abandon his crew to their fate. In less than 5 minutes, 3/4 of Nagumo's carrier force had been reduced to burning wrecks. The Kido Butai, which had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was dying in the very waters where Japan had expected to achieve its greatest victory. Only the carrier Hiryu, separated from the main formation, remained operational, but she was alone against the entire American Pacific Fleet. Captain Tomeo Kaku of Hiryu wasted no time in launching a counterstrike. At 10:58 a.m., 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, took off from Hiryu's deck. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown, identified through reconnaissance reports as the flagship of the enemy force. The Japanese strike found Yorktown at noon, her own aircraft having just returned from the devastating attack on the Japanese carriers. Despite desperate defensive fire and the efforts of American fighters, Kobayashi's bombers scored 3 direct hits on the carrier. The first bomb penetrated 4 decks before exploding, killing or wounding 66 men. The second bomb exploded in the smokestack, disrupting the ship's power systems. The third bomb started fires that threatened the aviation gasoline storage areas. But American damage control proved superior to Japanese expectations. Within an hour, Yorktown's crew had extinguished the fires, restored power, and resumed flight operations. When a second strike from Hiryu arrived at 2:45 p.m., 10 Kate torpedo bombers led by Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, they found what appeared to be an undamaged carrier and assumed it was a different ship. This second attack proved more devastating. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, causing severe flooding and knocking out all power. The carrier developed a dangerous list, and Captain Elliot Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandoned ship. Yorktown would survive this attack and be taken under tow, only to fall victim to a Japanese submarine 2 days later. But Hiryu's triumph was short-lived. American search planes had located the last Japanese carrier, and at 5:05 p.m., 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found their target. 4 direct hits transformed Hiryu into the same blazing wreck as her sister ships. By evening, all 4 carriers of the Kido Butai were either sunk or sinking, taking with them over 3,000 Japanese sailors and the dream of Pacific conquest. As night fell on June 4th, the ocean burned with the funeral pyres of Japanese naval aviation, while Admiral Yamamoto, still hundreds of miles away with the main battle fleet, contemplated the unthinkable reality that his master plan had ended in catastrophic defeat. The evening of June 4th found Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aboard his flagship Yamato, receiving reports that read like dispatches from hell itself. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the 4 carriers that had spearheaded Japan's conquest of the Pacific, were all burning or sunk. With them died not just ships and planes, but the irreplaceable pilots who had formed the backbone of Japanese naval aviation. In a single day, Japan had lost more carrier-trained aviators than they could replace in 2 years of war. The human cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Captain Jisaku Okada of Kaga had chosen to go down with his ship, locking himself in his cabin as fires consumed the carrier around him. On Soryu, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto similarly refused rescue, saluting his men from the bridge as the carrier slipped beneath the waves. These were not merely military casualties, but the death of an entire generation of naval expertise that Japan had spent decades building. Yamamoto faced the most agonizing decision of his career. His main battle fleet, centered around the massive battleships Yamato and Musashi, still possessed overwhelming firepower. The American carriers had expended most of their aircraft in the day's attacks and might be vulnerable to a night surface action. Some of his staff urged him to press forward, to seek the decisive battleship engagement that could still salvage something from the disaster. But the admiral who had planned Pearl Harbor was also a realist who understood that the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Without air cover, his battleships would be sitting targets for American land-based bombers from Midway when dawn came. The element of surprise was gone. The Americans were fully alert, and continuing the advance would only compound the disaster with further losses Japan could not afford. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that effectively ended Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. Operation MI is cancelled. All forces will withdraw. The most powerful naval armada in Japanese history turned away from Midway and began the long retreat toward home waters, carrying with it the broken dreams of empire. The final tragedy of the Kido Butai played out over the following hours, as rescue ships struggled to save what remained of the burning carriers. Destroyers Arashi and Nowaki took off Akagi's survivors before scuttling the flagship with torpedoes at dawn on June 5th. The carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack settled beneath the Pacific waves, taking Admiral Nagumo's career and reputation with her. Hiryu, the last carrier to fall, provided the most dramatic finale. Captain Tomeo Kaku had refused to abandon ship, remaining aboard as his crew fought desperately to save their vessel. When it became clear that the fires could not be controlled, he ordered the ship's remaining personnel to safety, while he and a volunteer skeleton crew attempted to beach the carrier on a nearby coral reef. The effort failed when Hiryu's ammunition magazines exploded in a final, thunderous detonation that could be heard 20 miles away. As referenced in John Parshall and Anthony Tully's authoritative work, Shattered Sword, the loss of trained aircrew was perhaps more devastating to Japanese naval aviation than the loss of the carriers themselves, as these pilots represented years of training and combat experience that could never be adequately replaced. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat. Japan's naval construction program, impressive as it was, could not match American industrial capacity that was now fully mobilized for war. The loss of 4 fleet carriers at Midway meant that Japan would never again possess the naval aviation strength necessary to conduct major offensive operations across the vast Pacific Ocean. Moreover, the myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since Pearl Harbor, lay shattered on the ocean floor alongside the sunken carriers. Throughout the Pacific, from Australia to Alaska, the news of Midway would inspire renewed resistance to Japanese expansion. The empire that had seemed unstoppable just days before now appeared vulnerable, and its enemies would press every advantage. American forces, meanwhile, had demonstrated that superior intelligence, tactical flexibility, and industrial capacity could overcome numerical disadvantage. The victory at Midway would provide the foundation for the island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces across the Pacific toward Japan itself. As dawn broke on June 6th, the last survivors of the Kido Butai were pulled from life rafts scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. Among them floated the remnants of aircraft, equipment, and personal effects that told the story of Japan's greatest naval disaster. The rising sun that had symbolized Japanese expansion now illuminated only wreckage and defeat. In the aftermath of Midway, the carefully constructed facade of Japanese invincibility crumbled like a house of cards in a typhoon. Emperor Hirohito received the news of the disaster in stunned silence while the Japanese government struggled to comprehend how their most powerful naval force had been annihilated in a single day. The official communiques spoke of tactical adjustments and strategic repositioning, but could not hide the fundamental truth that Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken. The human cost of the defeat extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Petty Officer First Class Juzo Mori, a veteran pilot who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, found himself floating in a life raft after Kaga's destruction, watching his shipmates disappear beneath the waves. The ocean was full of oil and bodies, he would later recall. We had thought ourselves invincible, but the sea showed us how quickly fortune can change. His testimony, preserved in Japanese naval archives, reflected the psychological trauma that would plague Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. Admiral Nagumo, rescued from the burning Akagi, faced a court of inquiry that would effectively end his career. Once hailed as the hero of Pearl Harbor, he now bore the stigma of Japan's greatest naval defeat. The admiral who had commanded with confidence just days before became withdrawn and hesitant, his spirit broken along with his fleet. He would later die by his own hand during the defense of Saipan in 1944, unable to bear the weight of his failure at Midway. The strategic ramifications rippled across the Pacific theater, like shock waves from an underwater explosion. General Douglas MacArthur, planning his return to the Philippines, received intelligence reports about Japanese fleet movements that revealed their dramatically reduced capability. Admiral Chester Nimitz, whose calculated gamble at Midway had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, now possessed the naval superiority necessary to launch offensive operations across the Central Pacific. Japanese industrial planners, meanwhile, confronted the harsh mathematics of naval warfare in the industrial age. The 4 carriers lost at Midway represented not just ships, but entire ecosystems of trained personnel, specialized equipment, and operational doctrine that had taken decades to develop. Replacing the carriers themselves would require 2 years of intensive construction, but replacing the experienced aircrew would prove impossible given the compressed timeline of wartime training programs. The technological implications proved equally devastating. Japan's naval aviation had relied heavily on veteran pilots who could maximize the performance of their aircraft through skill and experience. The wholesale loss of these experts meant that newer pilots, hastily trained and inexperienced, would have to face increasingly sophisticated American equipment and tactics. The qualitative advantage that Japanese aviation had enjoyed since Pearl Harbor was gone forever. Intelligence reports reaching Allied headquarters painted a picture of an empire struggling to adapt to its new reality. Intercepted communications revealed heated debates within the Japanese high command about whether to pursue a defensive strategy or attempt to rebuild offensive capability. Some officers advocated for immediate peace negotiations, recognizing that Japan's strategic position had become untenable, while hardliners insisted that one decisive victory could still reverse their fortunes. The economic burden of Midway extended far beyond immediate military costs. Japan's war economy, already strained by extensive territorial commitments, now faced the additional pressure of rebuilding its carrier fleet while maintaining defensive positions across the Pacific. Raw materials that had been allocated for offensive weapons now had to be diverted to defensive preparations, creating shortages that would plague Japanese industry for the remainder of the war. American war production, by contrast, was reaching full stride by late 1942. The Essex-class carriers already under construction would provide the United States Navy with more flight decks than Japan could ever hope to match, while pilot training programs were producing aviators at rates that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. The industrial disparity that Admiral Yamamoto had feared from the beginning was becoming an insurmountable advantage for America. Perhaps most significantly, Midway marked the psychological turning point of the Pacific War. Japanese confidence, built on 6 months of uninterrupted victory, gave way to doubt and defensive thinking. American morale, conversely, soared as news of the victory spread from Pearl Harbor to Washington. The nation that had seemed so vulnerable after Pearl Harbor now appeared capable of defeating Japan's best efforts. As summer turned to autumn in 1942, both sides prepared for the next phase of the conflict, with full understanding that Midway had fundamentally altered the strategic balance. Japan would fight on, but now from a position of increasing weakness rather than strength. 6 months after the smoke cleared over Midway's waters, the full magnitude of Japan's defeat became apparent as American forces launched their first major offensive in the Solomon Islands. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942, would have been impossible without the naval superiority secured at Midway. Japanese forces, lacking adequate air cover and naval support, found themselves fighting a defensive battle for which they were neither prepared nor equipped. The human stories emerging from Midway revealed the personal cost of imperial ambition. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor but missed Midway due to appendicitis, returned to find his entire air group decimated. "When I saw the empty ready rooms and the missing faces," he later wrote, "I understood that we had not merely lost ships, we had lost the heart of our naval aviation." His memoirs, published after the war, provided crucial insights into the psychological impact of the defeat on Japanese naval personnel. American intelligence analysts, studying captured documents and interrogating prisoners, began to understand the broader implications of their victory. Captain Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, noted in his classified reports that Japanese naval communications had become increasingly defensive in nature, with frequent references to preserving strength and avoiding decisive engagement. The aggressive spirit that had characterized Japanese operations since Pearl Harbor was clearly broken. The technological lessons of Midway proved equally significant for both sides. American damage control techniques, demonstrated by Yorktown's ability to resume operations after severe damage, became the standard for naval construction throughout the war. Japanese carriers, by contrast, were revealed to have dangerous vulnerabilities in their damage control systems, flaws that would plague every subsequent class of carrier they built. Admiral Yamamoto, facing the collapse of his strategic vision, attempted one final gamble in April 1943 with Operation I-Go, a massive air offensive designed to cripple American bases in the Solomons. The operation's failure, resulting in the loss of more irreplaceable veteran pilots, demonstrated that Japan could no longer sustain the attrition rates necessary for offensive operations. 3 weeks later, Yamamoto himself was killed when American fighters, guided by intercepted communications, shot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville. The industrial statistics told the story of two nations moving in opposite directions. By late 1943, American shipyards were launching one new Essex-class carrier every 6 weeks, while Japan struggled to complete even one carrier per year. The quantitative advantage that had briefly favored Japan at Pearl Harbor became an overwhelming American superiority that would only grow as the war continued. The strategic initiative had passed irreversibly to the United States. The Central Pacific Campaign, spearheaded by the new fast carrier task forces, began rolling back Japanese territorial gains at an accelerating pace. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, and the Philippine Sea. Each successive battle demonstrated American mastery of the amphibious warfare techniques that would carry them to Japan's doorstep. Perhaps most tellingly, Japanese naval strategy after Midway became increasingly desperate and theoretical. Plans for decisive battles using combined fleet operations gave way to suicide attacks and defensive positions designed merely to delay the inevitable. The mobile fleet action at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, saw Japan lose over 400 aircraft in 2 days, while inflicting minimal damage on American forces. The final assessment of Midway's impact came from an unexpected source. In his post-war interrogation, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who succeeded Yamamoto as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, stated simply, "Midway was the beginning of the end. After that battle, everything we did was merely postponing defeat, not seeking victory. His words captured the fundamental shift in Japanese strategic thinking that began in the waters northwest of that tiny atoll. By war's end, the Japanese empire that had seemed so formidable in December 1941 lay in ruins, its cities burned, its navy sunk, and its armies scattered across the Pacific. The dream of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, born of nationalist fervor and military hubris, had drowned in the blood-stained waters of Midway, along with 4 aircraft carriers and the illusion of invincibility. The Battle of Midway stands as perhaps history's most decisive naval engagement, a 5-minute span of aerial combat that determined the fate of nations and the future of the Pacific Ocean. In those critical moments when American dive bombers screamed down toward Japanese flight decks, the tide of World War II turned forever toward Allied victory and the birth of American naval supremacy that would define the post-war world.